My name is Heike Trishman, and I am an oil and gas partner in Watson Farley Williams, based in London. For today's episode, I'm very pleased that we are joined by gas and LNG market experts Nick Fulford, Andrew Duncan, and Ryan Pereira from GaffneyCline. I'm also very pleased to be joined by my colleague Christopher Osborne, a very experienced company commercial partner in our Bangkok office. The invitation you used to register for this event contains links to all of our biographies, as well as contact details, should you wish to get in touch. And of course, you see some contact details on this slide as well. Just in terms of agenda then, I will be doing a quick recap of what we have learned in our previous episodes of our LNG to Power webinar series, particularly our previous more general webinar on multi-user facilities and third-party access. Ryan and Nick will then develop this theme further and look at the global picture of market deregulation before Nick and Andrew consider Thailand's specific gas market features from an economic, and then Chris from a legal regulatory point of view, before Ryan moves on to presenting our conclusions, and we finally wrap up with questions and answers. Okay, diving right into it. Thank you. Those who have participated in our LNG to Power webinars before are familiar with this slide. And we talked about LNG as a key component in the world's transition to a net zero future, particularly in emerging markets such as Southeast Asia, including Thailand, obviously, that need to move away from coal to cleaner fuels for their electricity generation. We previously established that a change of the traditional point-to-point LNG value chain excuse me, which you can see in the center of this slide, and which was represented by the point-to-point LNG supplies to South Korea and Japan in the past. All of this is changing to a much more dynamic market with integrated components and new participants, particularly the so-called portfolio players or aggregators. And all of that resulted in a much deeper, much more flexible market. You can see on this slide all the various bits and pieces which have now supplemented the original point-to-point chain. Floating technologies combined with new sales models created by aggregators have changed the availability of LNG globally, there's no doubt, and allowed the emergence also of LNG to power projects. So looking at LNG to power projects in a very simplistic way, you will see this is really just the downstream part of the chain which I talked about just now. The use of an onshore LNG import terminal or a floating facility such as an FSRU to deliver regasified LNG to, for example, a dedicated power plant, using perhaps a separately owned gas pipeline system, creates a complex risk matrix of project-on-project risk, particularly each time ownership changes on those interfaces where ownership changes in the gas molecules and then also in the electricity. That obviously also creates each time a new risk. Which methods of addressing each such risk are the most appropriate in any given jurisdiction will depend obviously on the conditions and the regulatory rules that exist in the relevant jurisdiction. But appropriate corporate and contractual structuring tools may be used in LNG to power projects as effective risk mitigants, and they're being used in that way all the time. And if you're interested in further details on that, please access our LNG to Power landing page on our website, and we can send you a link to that. What now happens if we are introducing more parties either on the supply side or on the offtake side? So the introduction, for example, of mandatory multi-user regimes and certain infrastructure ownership requirements and or mandatory third-party access rules that exist in some jurisdictions, they obviously leave less room for maneuver, which complicates the risk matrix and may make less risk mitigants be available. Why might a country introduce third-party access requirements in the first place if this makes things much more complicated? Well, in most regulated gas markets, infrastructure was developed and remains owned and operated by a few, often government-owned, vertically integrated companies. They were obviously in place in order to develop the gas market in the first place. However, this sort of monopoly over the infrastructure has now given them exclusive access to all parts of the affected gas market. And in the past, mandatory third-party access rules supported by the requirement to unbundle, that is, separate out competitive activities such like gas importation and supply on the one hand from the natural monopoly sectors using infrastructure like the production, storage, regasification, and pipeline transmission. And then another tool is privatization of the relevant company where appropriate. And all of these have been used in the US and the UK and the EU and also Japan, except the privatization. And of course, other markets in the world to dismantle this natural monopoly to allow new companies to enter the market. And the overall aim of that is obviously to increase competition, to improve thereby supply efficiency and service quality, to hopefully reduce prices for end customers, to ensure efficient infrastructure utilization, and overall it all works to strengthen that country's energy security. Each third-party access provision will affect all market participants, there is no doubt, some more favorably than others, depending on their position in the market. And these companies are often representing conflicting market interests. So it is the country's gas market regulator who therefore needs to set the rules of the game to ensure fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory infrastructure access and be given the necessary powers, that's very important, to enforce these rules. So whilst third-party access requirements will allow increased access to supply on the one hand, as we can see in this slide, and customers on the other side, they will also mandate the need for multiple access agreements to the relevant infrastructure. So each new entrant will need a new agreement, which obviously creates new complexities and associated risks of mismatch. For example, when each of these new entrants are scheduling their supply and when they nominate for the gas to be regasified, for the LNG to be regasified, and balancing in the end, and obviously also in terms of gas quality. But we now also have potentially an issue with creditworthiness of these new entrants and potentially price stability as these new entrants access LNG in the open market, often rather than through long-term agreements. So at this point, I think I hand over to Ryan to introduce us to some global deregulation examples in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Heike. Thanks very much for that oversight there. And a warm welcome extended from the GaffneyCline team to all of you, particularly in Asia Pac and also elsewhere around the world. So as we think about this, the global insights into gas market deregulation, in that introduction, Heike, you laid some really solid foundations on which to build on in today's webinar. And as I personally reflect on your introduction, it's clear that gas to power, and in particular LNG to power projects, are growing not only in importance around the world, but also in terms of commercial and contractual complexity, as we'll discuss today. And this complexity really increases further when there are changes to features such as third-party access to import facilities and other gas infrastructure, of course, such as is taking place in Thailand. Our team have been fortunate enough to be closely involved with the evolution of Thailand's gas market deregulation over the past 7 years since 2014. And as Nick will explain shortly, gas and power market deregulations are complex, even in ordinary times, but we're now living in extremely extraordinary times. And it's somewhat encouraging to see that progress has been made in Thailand at a time of extraordinary change and volatility in global energy markets. As we consider perhaps where we are today on the journey towards deregulation and where we might travel from here, I wanted to recap on the recent and projected state of gas markets. So at the diagram at the top, I wanted to start inwards and expand outwards. So first, looking at the LNG supply picture, the rate of growth has come, I'd say, in bumpy waves. Despite a record year of final investment decisions in 2019, 2020, for obvious reasons, was a very low year. And then 2021 started very strongly with the announcement of the Qatari North Field expansion project, which will take Qatari LNG capacity from 77 million tonnes per annum up to 110 million tonnes per annum by 2025, with further expansion potential out on the horizon to 2030. However, the last couple of years, of course, has also seen project delays in Mozambique to FIDs were announced there for various reasons, and also the so-called second wave of US LNG projects, which had stalled for a little while, but we've noted a real comeback in the last couple of months in particular, especially with the pricing spike, which I'll talk about shortly. But furthermore, to add some complexity into the supply mix, there have been unplanned outages and unplanned maintenance at several plants globally, which has really helped to tighten supply. So moving outwards to the demand side, LNG continues to be one of the fastest growing industries globally. And I think a lot of people actually forget that. Even despite the global pandemic, volumes in 2020 were marginally up on 2019. And personally, I wasn't surprised to see the quicker than anticipated rebound in energy demand and also gas and LNG demand post-COVID-19 and into 2021. I expect to see that going forward into 2022. But who will be driving that growth? Of course, it's obvious that going forward, China and India will be the main demand centers. But the greatest area of interest is perhaps amongst the new and emerging South and East Asian buyers. And that is why we focus today's webinar on Thailand, being one of the most promising countries for future LNG growth. Along with this growth, though, will be a need to consider not just onshore LNG terminals, but a substantial increase in offshore FSRUs, which of course come with quite different commercial and contractual risk management requirements. But the unsynchronized way, really, in which supply and demand have grown, have therefore exacerbated pricing volatility, as you'll see on the chart below, in the spot and short to medium term deals. 2020 saw LNG cargoes changing hands for record low prices of around $2 per MMBTU in mid-2020. And this was then followed by an early surge in 2020-21, taking LNG prices to an unprecedented level back then of $30+. The middle of 2021 saw a temporary reprieve for LNG buyers before prices once again surged to new highs in September and October, reaching new records of over $50. But of course, neither of those prices are representative of the true long-run marginal cost of global LNG. So when looking at this picture in terms of oil index contracts, for simplicity, I've ignored time lag effects here. We can see from the chart below how the last 2 years has moved from a balanced market to a hugely oversupplied market, some argue, to a very tight market in which we sit today in the coming months. This, of course, has implications for the market deregulation in Thailand, and which is why I highlight it here. From a contractual perspective later on, Chris will talk to some of the risks that are requiring special care, especially if we've seen changes in contract durations, price indexations, volume and destination flexibility, renegotiations and disputes. and preferences in each of these areas seem to change extremely rapidly. And if all that was not enough to contend with, the last 2 to 3 years, and arguably the next decade, that period in which the Thai market is being liberalised, will require a careful navigation of global energy transition trends. Nick will talk a little bit about this. We will need to consider decarbonisation of the gas chain, carbon neutral LNG cargoes, and an increased focus on carbon intensity, abatement and policy regulations, which are all features being discussed this week at COP26 in the UK, which is where I reside. So with that, it is a good point to hand over to Nick to start taking us through his personal insights from over 40 years of being involved in several global gas market deregulation processes.
Okay, thank you very much, Ryan. And as you've heard, the supply side of the Asian gas market has been, well, extremely volatile, shall we say, in the last few months. So let's take a step back for a moment and examine how that might contribute to the bigger picture affecting the way in which the Thai gas market is evolving. So as I look back on all the successful market reforms that have taken place over the last, well, 30 years or more, there are, in my opinion anyway, 3 ingredients which typically work together to align all the stakeholders in the gas supply chain. The first of these is a healthy and competitive upstream supply environment with suppliers who are eager to sell their gas to customers in end markets. The second is an appetite among customers, both large and small, to find the most competitive energy suppliers. And this applies whether you're a major industrial user, a power station, or indeed a family managing on a tight budget. And of course, those energy customers, they're also voters and industries who typically have a very powerful voice in the nation's economy. And so government policy to facilitate more competitive ways of selling energy is, in effect, the third major component. Now, we've seen these major pillars of market reform play out in different ways with different emphasis, but they're all typically present. For example, my own experience back in the UK, market changes that took place in the 90s were a result really of industrial consumers pressing for access to lower cost gas supplies from the North Sea and lobbying very hard to the government and gas regulators to support that goal, with an end result that moved things considerably. In Europe, the major push has really come from an ideological perspective, with the EU with its very pro-competitive stance and the focus on the creation of a single market for natural gas and indeed power. In the US, different again, huge number of diverse sources of supply that have helped create reform, going way back to the unbundling of the gas purchasing and the pipeline contracts, which occurred in the 1980s. So as we've heard, the energy environment in 2021 is further complicated by the move to decarbonize, and actually balancing these needs with the economic necessity of low-cost energy was one of the key features of Prime Minister Prayut's speech this week in Glasgow, which is kind of interesting to listen to in the context of our topic today. Each of these 3 factors influences the other, of course, and perhaps the biggest consideration in the current market is how price changes are perceived, which is hard to overemphasize, I think, just at the moment. So as we all know, the costs of energy are made up of 2 things, really. It's the wholesale price, which is set by global supply and demand factors, which is really what Ryan was referring to earlier. And then there's the cost of service, which is a feature of market efficiency. Now, particularly for less informed energy buyers, one of the biggest risks of any market reform is that consumers associate high prices with the reform process. In the UK, the US, and Europe, supply factors led to really quite a significant fall in energy costs, which consumers typically associated with market unbundling. Now, today's environment obviously may not be so forgiving. So let's spend a minute or two charting the path from a fully regulated supply with an incumbent monopoly to a diverse competitive marketplace. And we'll move to the next slide, please. Now, I've set this out under three main headings. First of all, the supply, which we've talked about a little bit already today, transmission and storage, and then thirdly, gas markets. And really, from everything we've learned over the last many years of market structuring, it's become clear that the supply chain can really be divided into those functions that really benefit from a competitive arrangement and those that don't or in fact can't. So while the supply of natural gas can come from many different sources, the form of contract can look very different. All suppliers typically have to use certain key physical assets, such as pipelines, for example, LNG regas terminals, storage, things that you don't want to have to build more than once. On this diagram, the top line really concerns the way in which supply contracts typically evolve. The middle line relates to the contracts that come into force to enable non-discriminatory third-party access to critical infrastructure, which we'll hear more about. And the bottom line refers to the ways in which the gas is sold to end customers or traded between market players. Most markets start with a very similar arrangement to the one that existed in Thailand until recently, with PTT being the sole supplier of natural gas. It's a model that applied in most of the European gas and power markets, usually with a state ownership feature as well. Because of the captive nature of the market, gas or LNG supplies were entered into in a long-term take-or-pay basis with, frankly, no real volume risk on the part of the single buyer. But of course, as more buyers enter into the market, this situation starts to change. And retaining market share goes hand in hand with the degree of take-or-pay commitment being made. Finally, as the market becomes fully competitive, you see the entry of financial as well as physical players who are able to participate, helping both sellers and buyers to hedge risk and create a long-term financially stable arrangement with less reliance on take or pay, but with the emergence of a wholesale price as well. So as demand grows for users to access key assets, again, most markets start with perhaps one or two additional users besides the infrastructure owner, but eventually a network code emerges, as it has done in Thailand, which puts the incumbent monopoly player essentially on a level playing field with newcomers and everybody else. This has probably been the most difficult transition in most markets, especially actually in those markets that rely on key LNG features where control is paramount. So this very gradual approach usually applies to accessing customers too, where the phasing usually involves very large gas users, such as power generators, to start with, and kind of grows from there. Now, there's definitely been a lot of debate over the years, much of which I recall, in some detail, about the benefits of bringing competition right down to the individual energy user, especially on a residential level. But if given the choice, I think most consumers embrace it. Interestingly, though, Europe, in that sense, is much further ahead of the US in terms of consumer choice. And on the next slide, we'll see why. So one of the main reasons for that is that in North America and some other jurisdictions, the regulation of energy markets differs considerably at a state level, with some states prioritizing competitive energy much more than others. So while there is a consistent set of rules applied to energy that moves between states and usually internationally, the same can't be said about how customers are approached in particular states. In Europe, that situation is reversed. The reach of the EU is such that, unlike in the US, the EU is able to apply overarching rules that individual member countries need to apply, with very few exceptions granted, typically only where a gas market is considered to be in the very early phases of development. So as we move to Asia, the predominance of LNG starts to affect how markets are working, but the tremendous growth in LNG market participation, the lowering of barriers to entry, these are all major factors that really help with market competition. Now, as we all understand very well, Thailand has a goal of becoming a major LNG hub. And by creating this dynamic and resilient gas market at home, that vision can obviously become a reality in a relatively short time, particularly given Thailand's strategic positioning in the region. So a major part of that evolution will arise from the evolving supply situation. And Andrew is going to talk about that next for a few minutes.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm going to talk about some Thai-specific supply and demand considerations. Have the next slide, please. Let's start with Thailand's primary energy balance, because that's really the starting point for looking at energy. And we can see from the graphic on the right that historically Thailand domestic energy supply has come from a thin sliver of coal, some domestic oil production, and a healthy wedge of gas production. And in the last few years, the start of renewable supply, which of course we hope will continue to grow. But the domestic supply has always fallen short of primary energy demand, and the balance has been made up of imports, of course. In the early years, that was coal and heavy fuel oil, and in later years, gas imported from Myanmar, and in the past few years, gas imported as LNG from overall. Focusing in on domestic gas supply side, the graphic on the right shows Thailand's gas reserves over production ratio, which is basically the reserves in the ground divided by the annual production. So it basically tells you the years of cover that you've got of domestic gas. And you can see that that has been steadily declining over time. And that is partly a feature of the geology of the Thailand basin, and it's also a feature of the maturity of the Thailand basin. And at the moment, the R over P ratio is, as you can see, still gently declining, but holding its own at about 4 to 5 years. Hopefully, investment in the basin will boost that, but it's still a very slim margin. Next slide, please. Now let's look at 60 years of Thai gas supply and demand, starting back in the 1980s, when domestic gas first started production in earnest, and projecting forward to 2041. We can see that domestic gas supply peaked in 2017, 2018, and is forecast to decline going forward. There's an additional tranche of gas coming in from the Malaysia-Thai Joint Development Area. That's Thailand's share of that JDA. And then the domestic gas has been supplemented by imports from Myanmar, shown in dark green on top of that. Those Myanmar contracts are set to wind down over the next few years, and whether that sliver of gas is increased or not will depend a lot on Myanmar's own supply-demand situation, and whether they choose to extend or renew those contracts or not. Finally, in the last few years, since 2011, we can see an expanding tranche of LNG imports. And this, this has started through the Matapud import terminal. And if we project the 2018-2019 gas demand level forward, we can see a supply gap opening up. Now, how is this supply gap going to be supplied? Perhaps there may be some new gas discoveries in Myanmar. Perhaps the Thai-Cambodia JDA open up and some additional gas coming from there. Or perhaps a decline of gas in the energy mix. But looked at realistically, a large part of that gap will have to be supplied from imported LNG. And you can see the capacities, Matapud, the proposed Nong Fab import terminal, and typical FSRU plotted to see how they might fill the gap. And I think you can conclude from that that there is a market for imported LNG opening up in the country. I'll hand back the baton to Nick now to give us an overview of the Thailand gas market.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I've been visiting Thailand regularly now since about 2015. So I've been very fortunate to see firsthand the major strides being made towards an open, competitive market, obviously designed to offer customers essentially lower energy prices. So I've got to know many of the stakeholders who've contributed so much to the progress shown on this slide. And in fact, the slide itself comes from our friends at PTIT, who've been very actively supporting the program. Starting on the left-hand side of the slide, it's clear that between LNG, domestic gas, and pipeline imports that Andrew has just been telling us about, Thailand benefits now from an array of competitive sources of gas, which will underpin the nation's supply for many years to come. If we move directly to the right-hand side, we've got an array of industrial buyers, power generators all lining up to secure gas and LNG for their various projects, though it's still not clear how much of this will be reflected with other customer groupings. In the middle, the moves that PTT and EGAT are making to support competition in response to the policy set by the ministry, including actually a release gas program very similar to the one I was involved with at British Gas many years ago, plus the regulatory steps set out by the ERC. They're all starting to create the foundation of a more freely traded market in gas. In short, a whole lot of progress has been made, but a lot of change is now having to be addressed by suppliers, network operators, and customers alike. So over the next few minutes, Chris will take you through some of the legal and contractual considerations that really arise from all this degree of change.
Thanks, Nick. Could we have the next slide, please, Carlton? Thanks. So this is what third-party access in Thailand looks like today. Multiple users looking for access to limited infrastructure. And right now, it's all about gas to power. And the driver is demand created by the Energy Industry Act, which permitted retail electricity sales by independent power producers and small power producers. And these IPPs and SPPs are now looking to access cheaper LNG through the spot market and also through the medium-term market. The regulatory framework is also created by the EIA, and it requires the owners of network systems to allow other licensees to connect and utilize the networks. And it also sets out principles of access to ensure safety and security, the benefit to energy users and the public, and also to prevent unjust discrimination. The access codes have been put in place by network owners already, but it's still necessary from a commercial perspective to negotiate access agreements with the network owner in order to actually use that network. And those who select and negotiate the best access agreements will have the best rights of access to the network. And this becomes more important in a competitive environment with multiple competitors, which is what we're seeing right now. The TPA regime, which was introduced in 2014 by the Energy Regulatory Commission, prevents network owners from giving preference to its affiliates. But there's a catch, because there's a grandfathering provision which enables affiliates to have priority access to those network assets for existing contracts. So the amount of third-party access in the early years will be restricted by the volume of those existing contracts. And in terms of parallels, we see similarities with Japan, the world's largest LNG importer, which liberalized third-party access in 2017. Japan saw limited pipeline infrastructure, limited availability for interconnections, and this created issues in scheduling access to the pipeline infrastructure. And this was made even more acute by a recent shift towards spot LNG contracts. And we see Thailand facing a similar situation with multiple users wanting access presently to a single terminal for spot contracts. And we expect that in the first few years, there'll be a bottleneck in scheduling access to the existing network as a result of the grandfathered capacity. So from a commercial perspective, when you're looking at your access contracts, your access agreements, it will be very important to make sure that your rights of access in those access agreements match your importation requirements, which brings us to LNG supply on the next slide. The LNG sale and purchase agreements are one of the most important agreements in determining the profitability of an IPP or an SPP. LNG is a cyclical market and it's characterized by frequent price variations. And this is reflected in very complex pricing provisions that you tend to see in LNG SPAs. As an example, you can expect to see slope, S-curve, floors and caps, indexation references, crude delinking, price averaging, and more recently, price review clauses. And these are concepts that have been developed over the past 10 or 15 years. And these pricing clauses will continue to evolve and continue to get more complicated. Net zero is likely to be the next big price factor as energy producers look to decarbonize. So simply copying a pricing mechanism from a contract that's a few years old might not give you the best result. So it's important to bring in a team of pricing experts that are familiar with the current market practice and that also have an eye towards future trends. And this is really important because pricing disputes are on the rise globally. Osaka Gas from Japan and Kogal from Korea, two very established players, are now in arbitration as a result of pricing disputes. And the message here is that if they can get involved in a pricing dispute, anyone in Asia can. So it's important to get the best market practice wording for pricing in your LNG SPA. Other important aspects of LNG SPAs are destination restrictions and resale restrictions. And these have been taken so seriously in Japan that the Japanese Fair Trade Commission has already regarded destination restrictions and resale restrictions as being anti-competitive. Now, at the moment, it's a bit of a theoretical point because there's only one terminal available in Thailand at Map to Put. But when Nong Thab and Gulf open up their terminals, you may be in the position where you want to divert an LNG shipment to one of those terminals if you can't get the access that you need at Map to Put. And LNG SPAs often contain a destination clause which prevents the LNG from being delivered anywhere else apart from the destination in the contract. So going forward, it will be important to make sure that your SPAs give you destination flexibility to access new infrastructure. And that might be new terminals, it might be another FSRU in the Gulf of Thailand. So another issue is if your LNG delivery in 1 month is more than you need for your power generation, you might want to sell the surplus. But often LNG SPAs will contain a restriction on reselling. So it's important to make sure that you've got resale flexibility if there's any possibility of ordering more LNG than you need in any particular time. Scheduling the LNG delivery is also important in a TPA regime, especially if there are multiple users of limited network assets. If the tanker arrives early, will you have enough access slots to unload when it arrives early, or will the tanker need to wait? And likewise, if the tanker arrives late, will you have lost your access slot? Will you be able to unload at all? And more importantly, the SPA needs to synchronize with the access agreement and with your overall contract structure to make sure that you can offload it and access the network when the tanker arrives. which brings us on to balancing international risk on the next slide. I guess the opening point is that a well-prepared LNG SPA is an absolute key to your profitability as a power producer. And the single biggest risk is delivery risk. If your LNG SPA is on FOB terms or free on board terms, and the tanker sinks in a storm, well, the LNG won't arrive, and that will be your cost. Insurance might cover the cost of the lost LNG, but will it cover the costs of business interruption in LNG supply to your power plant? It interferes with your profitability. You can reduce this risk by using delivery terms DES, DAT, DAP, and these will delay payment until delivery at ship, at terminal, or at place. But you still have a scheduling risk, as your access agreement will place restrictions on when and how much LNG you can deliver to the network. So again, if the LNG tanker arrives early or late, and this interferes with your third-party access schedule, the question is, who pays for that under the LNG SPA? And this can be quite complicated because LNG SPAs in Asia tend to be governed either by English law or by New York law. And each one of these are common law systems. And these are very different from the civil law jurisdictions like Thailand. So it's important to make sure that the lawyers that you have working for you are English or New York qualified, and that they review the SPA before you sign it, not after. And this is very much compounded by the fact that disputes under LNG SPAs are subject to international arbitration. And this is very different from Thai court proceedings. And it's very different to access disputes, which are resolved in Thailand, ultimately by the ERC. And the costs of international arbitration are potentially much higher than what you would see in the Thai courts. Your success in arbitration will largely depend on the quality of expert evidence you produce to the arbitral tribunal. And if you haven't already engaged with international experts and advisors at the time of drafting your SPA, it makes it that much more difficult to get the expert opinion you need when you need it. So engaging experts before you finalize the SPA can make your case stronger and can actually prevent a dispute from arising in the first place. One thing we notice is that companies in Asia are often reluctant to talk about problems during negotiations. They don't want to talk about what might go wrong in the future. And quite often they will defer addressing problems until they actually arise in the hope of using a relationship-based approach to dispute resolution. And the problem with this approach, the problem with not addressing problems during negotiations is that the contract won't provide you with the rights you need if you don't address them when you're negotiating. And the LNG sellers will strictly, in our experience, they will absolutely strictly enforce their contractual rights. And they will have very little regard for an ongoing relationship. They will just perform in accordance with the wording of the contract. And it might sound counterintuitive, but engaging lawyers, experts, and advisors who have already seen disputes in the LNG sector and having them help draft the LNG SPA and advise if a problem arises during delivery is one of the best ways that we've seen to actually reduce your risk under an LNG SPA. And this is important because properly managing disputes and avoiding arbitration in the first place is a very good way of maximizing profitability. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Ryan for conclusions.
Thanks, Chris. And as observed just now, before coming on to some of the Q&A discussion, I think what you said has really prompted some questions to what yourself, Nick, Andrew, and Heike have also said, and we'll get to those in a second. But before moving to those, I'd like to conclude by sharing some of my own takeaways from participating, not just in the webinar today, but several of our discussions in the preparation for today's webinar with our wider teams at GaffneyCline and Watson Farley Williams. So of course, our main aim for today's session was to share our insights from participating in several global energy market deregulation processes, each of which have got their own learnings. And with this, I hope that all participants here today, and thank you for joining, are able to learn from yesterday and take steps to act today in order to prepare for the months and years ahead in the Thai journey. So we'll just come to the concluding slide now, where you can see that we've shared some of the key risks and problems on the left-hand side to avoid that have led to challenges in other international gas market deregulations. And I won't go through these individually, but I think it's fair to say that whatever your role is in the Thai gas and power market, without a doubt, the highest importance, as Chris mentioned, should be given to starting preparations today, or starting yesterday, as it were. As once the process is underway, some of the risks that Chris outlined start to be irreversibly baked into those projects and transactions, with costly consequences and loss of value in projects and contracts. So it's essential that all market participants continue to work closely together from what we've seen, to collaborate and to ensure clear and consistent lines of communication. This will ensure that robust market mechanisms are discussed, developed, and implemented that will meet the needs of the Thai energy landscape going forward. And policy and regulation should in turn follow suit and be realistic, fair, stable, of course, and avoid introducing inefficiencies such as those caused by rate caps and other price distortions. And there's several examples of which we're facing in global gas market deregulations at the moment. So if we look at the Lotus diagram that we created on the right-hand side, it's very simple. But what we're trying to say here that is, in terms of market participation, it is useful to summarize a selection of comments made by each of my colleagues and speakers. So firstly, Nick explained the importance of customers, the need for an appetite among customers, both large and small, to find the most competitive energy suppliers. And this applies whether the customer is a major industrial user, a power station, or indeed a family managing on a tight budget. Andrew then looked at the role of the upstream and LNG supply environment. And most importantly here is the key role that incumbents, as well as the new market entrants, will have to play in sourcing and supplying competitive LNG to various customers in end markets, particularly as LNG increases in importance in the Thai energy mix, as Andrew showed. But, really wrapping around all of this, Chris and Heike both shared extremely useful insights into the role of the regulator and government in ensuring that appropriate frameworks are selected that encourage fair and non-discriminatory access to infrastructure. And in addition to this, each market participant will have to balance several risks in order to profit and ensure that contracts are well structured, synchronized, and flexible to the changing market conditions that will be faced. So our webinar today has hopefully illustrated to you that there are several potential and differing marketing designs, but the key for Thailand is one that functions properly through consistent market rules and processes and a robust legislative framework. Ultimately, of course, market reforms live or die by what the energy customers make of it. If they are happy, then the process is deemed successful. And if they're not, then this can often lead to perceived failure of the market deregulation. Finally, amidst the global energy transition, we are confident that LNG and gas in general has a key role to support, a key and essential role, I should say, to support renewables. And this is especially true in Thailand. And although market deregulations can often be seen as a looming dark grey cloud, if approached and implemented taking heed of global insights, there can indeed, as our title suggests, be a silver lining and a successful set of outcomes. So we do see a few questions, and I'll now hand over to Heike to kick off the participant-led question and answer session. Please feel free to continue to post your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many of these as we can during the remaining time of the webinar with suitable follow-ups if we don't get around to these in the remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to all our speakers. Obviously, I hope you found this webinar as intriguing and interesting as I have, because I can say I learned a lot, definitely. As Ryan said, a few questions have come in, and we can try to attempt answering those in the time available. And I wanted to start with Chris, perhaps, not so much as a colleague, but really as the only one amongst us being based in Bangkok. You are sort of immersed in the daily energy challenges and opportunities presented to Thailand, obviously not just in gas and LNG, but also in renewables. Do you feel the pace of change having evolved over the past few years? And how do you see it evolving going forward? I mean, we had a few projections, but I wondered what you see on the ground.
I mean, look, since I first got to Thailand 20 years ago, there's been massive change. I mean, when I first arrived, retail sales of electricity weren't possible at all. And deregulation, I don't think was even being discussed. And now we've got, very progressive third-party access already in place for the gas infrastructure. And, in terms of rates of progress, I think what I have seen, and this isn't just specifically for gas, but just generally speaking here, it tends to be cyclical, a bit like the LNG pricing system. I mean, you'll go for years where nothing happens. Then all of a sudden you'll see a decade's worth of regulatory reform happening in 1 year. And I think we've seen, a large amount of that happening in the past years with the issuances of all of these licenses. And, a large amount of my practice is renewable energy, and I like LNG as a transition towards that. And I think one thing that I've also seen in terms of regulatory drivers is that Thailand was one of the first governments in the region to roll out a renewable energy framework. It was one of the first to offer tariff subsidies for solar and wind, and it has a huge portfolio of all of that. I think Thailand has stepped back from tariff subsidies for renewables in the past couple of years. But what we have seen is the private sector stepping forward to fill that gap. And instead of relying on government tariffs for PPAs with EGAT or PEA, we're seeing the private sector, step up and have rooftop solar in the commercial and industrial space with corporate PPAs. And again, this is made possible by the deregulation in the Energy Industry Act. And that what we see is a huge appetite from the private sector to actually take this forward to the extent that it's allowed. So I think it'll be a step-by-step approach. I mean, this is a complicated, it's very complicated when you deregulate a network. But what we're seeing is very progressive and very optimistic about what will happen. There will always be bumps in the road for this. But again, we're seeing the private sector, ready, willing, and able to go forward on that. So I think in terms of the regulatory pace, right now it looks good, and looking for good things in the next few years as well.
Great. Ryan, do you want to take over the next question?
Thanks, Heike. There's another question that's popped up here, and I suppose it's to Nick, really, if I read it out. It's the broadening it out a little bit. I'll just read out the question. So it says, what are the top trends amidst the energy transition, especially around the focus on carbon management and decarbonisation of the gas value chain? And the second part to that is, how can Thailand best position itself to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the energy transition? And that there's a slight second question that's coming around the role of LNG aggregators and importers in that whole mix and the transition itself. So a fair bit to talk about there, Nick.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. I'll try and keep it short. I suppose, from an energy transition perspective, you can look at things in the context of today's talk. You can look at things from the two ends of the spectrum. So on the one hand, you've got the LNG suppliers and what they're doing. And on the other hand, you've got the market. So just starting for a moment with suppliers. And obviously, I'm talking to you today from here in Houston. And within a couple of hours drive of here, there are 5 or 6 major LNG export facilities, which are sending US gas around the world, including to Thailand. And they had a big wake-up call, I suppose, a couple of years ago now, when the French government failed to approve an LNG export contract to France. And the basis for that was the carbon intensity of the LNG being exported. So that was followed very rapidly by investors, international investors, large banks, pension funds, starting to get very cautious about investment in carbon-based fuels. So most of those developers, both existing and particularly the new ones, are looking at all sorts of ways to reduce the carbon emissions of their LNG. And actually, I should sort of say more specifically, it's greenhouse gas emissions, because for the LNG industry, fugitive methane emissions are a huge part of the challenge to be addressed. And that's had a lot of discussion in Glasgow. But as I talk to a lot of those LNG exporters, the thing that is probably the most challenge to them is that they can invest hundreds of millions of dollars in carbon capture and ways to decarbonize. But right now, there's no real differentiation in the market. So if you spend all this money and you're selling lower carbon LNG into the market, there's no tangible way to recognize that, at least not formally. So that brings us to the market, where obviously in Thailand, the Climate Change Act is being considered. The power sector, obviously in Thailand, is one of the sort of primary targets for mechanisms to reduce carbon. And different ways are being examined to recognize the cost of carbon in the supply chain, obviously with the kind of minimal effect on customers. So, so I think for Thailand, for anywhere really, a kind of clear regulatory process which starts to recognize the role of carbon and indeed methane emissions in the supply chain, such that there's a kind of an evolutionary process to incorporate carbon in the cost of energy. That's obviously way more important than what I would call sort of sudden or significant changes in the way things are done, which is usually the prime reason why any kind of regulatory or market reform process falls apart. It is typically this idea of sudden change, which isn't communicated effectively. So in terms of LNG aggregators, one of the things we've been pressing for actually in GaffneyCline is a kind of a standardized approach to LNG, to actually measure the carbon intensity. So in the same way you buy a fridge or a dishwasher from the supermarket, has a label on it which tells you how carbon intensive it is. The same could be done with LNG, and I think over the next few years we'll see this kind of mechanism come in, where there's a clear recognition. But yeah, so with that I'll hand back. But from an energy transition point of view, it's probably the biggest feature of debate in the LNG market right now, bar none.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time, unfortunately. It's just after 11 UK time, and I think we stop there. We have a few more questions. We can catch up with the relevant people who have asked those questions by email. I wanted to say a huge big thank you again to GaffneyCline and to Chris in Bangkok, and also to our BD team and events team for getting this off the ground and making it such a success, because I think the webinar was really well presented, and hugely interesting topics were being discussed. So hopefully you also all found it very interesting, and thank you for your participation. And as I said, the webinar was being recorded, and you will be sent the link to that recording. Thank you very much, everybody, and hopefully see you during our next episode. Thank you.